Welcome back to Sensitivity Sessions, where we talk about how to find ease and purpose as a highly sensitive person living in an overstimulating world. I'm your host, Stephanie Gardner-Wright, a licensed psychotherapist and coach for highly sensitive people. Today on the show, we're talking about an interesting topic that you may not have heard of yet, and it's all about religious trauma and spiritual abuse. So this is something that my friend Natalie Kember, who's a fellow therapist in Michigan, specializes in. Natalie and I live geographically close in Michigan, so we've gotten together many times for coffee to talk about high sensitivity, religious trauma, and spiritual abuse. And I've learned a lot from her as she's pursued the specialization in the world of religious trauma and spiritual abuse. Let's tune in as we talk about how to define what these terms mean, how to know if you might be in a spiritually or religiously abusive environment, and how to begin along a healing path as a highly sensitive person experiencing these things. We'll also talk resources for folks and how to begin finding a therapist who may specialize in these intersections.
Well, I'm so glad we got together to have this conversation today. So
Me too.
let's just give a little quick background about what we're like, orient ourselves for the people listening. What is a highly sensitive person? And then I'll jump in and talk about what is spiritual abuse and religious trauma. So we have a little bit of a foundation to jump from.
Perfect. Yeah, so when we're talking about highly sensitive people, what we're really talking about is people that are more affected by their environments and they're more responsive to their environment. So there's a continuum of sensitivity. Every single person on earth is on it, but there are ends of that. So there's low sensitivity, there's more of a medium sensitivity, and then there's folks that are highly sensitive. So where you are really aware of what's going on around you. So you're going to be much more aware of all of those little nuances and details than your average person with lower sensitivity would have. And highly sensitive people are actually about 30% of the population.
It's pretty fascinating to think of so many people out there. Is this kind of like a newer discovered thing? Like
That's
that
a good
term?
question.
Yeah.
Yeah, so term highly sensitive person has been around since the 90s, but really the research or the thoughts about temperamental sensitivity are going back more than 100 years. So there's just been different terms for it. There's different theories about it. Most people have heard about Elaine Aron if they've heard of highly sensitive people, which is really the term that she coined, but there's a lot of research in the last 40 years too that's ongoing. So it's pretty cool to see how the research is unfolding.
So in a way, it's kind of interesting because the field that I work in a little bit more with religious trauma and spiritual abuse is very new and emerging. The HSP world is not quite as new in a sense, but still, when we're talking about like the history of psychology, these are pretty new emerging things, which is exciting
Right.
to be a part
Mhm.
of.
It is to be on the cutting edge of these things and be really seeing what happens as the research is changing and taking shape, which you're really
Yeah.
seeing too in your
Yeah.
area of expertise.
Yeah, lots of new funding happening, lots of people going
Mhm.
to get their doctorates and starting to declare this is what I'm studying. And so it's pretty
Yeah,
cool to see.
it is.
So I'll talk just a quick, like brief overview. What is spiritual abuse and religious trauma? Now, there's two different terms for a reason. So spiritual abuse is something that can take place in a very wide range of contexts, which I think is really important to say upfront. A lot of times we talk about this within a church setting, which is where, in a sense, people might think it's more common. We don't have statistics to back that, but it seems to be more of what we tend to think of. But it can also take place within a family system, just an interpersonal relationship. We see it with domestic violence sometimes. It can take place within a workplace, a school, these multi-level marketing or those type of organizations. And we're also talking about cults. Like it can happen in all sorts of settings. It can happen in new age. It can happen in, I've heard of it in yoga studios. Like this is not just within a church context. So I think that's important to know. The reality of what it basically is using like a spiritual concept, a higher power, and manipulating it in a way that is used to control somebody, control their actions, their thoughts, their behaviors. And that can take place in lots of different ways, manifesting depending differently on what situation we're talking about. But it's just this concept of we're using a spiritual concept or a god or whatever, and we're manipulating it in a way to control you or keep you contained in some sense. Now, religious trauma is obviously the word religion's in there. So we're talking more about within a church community, or this can also happen within like a family context or domestic violence type situations too. But That's when we're talking about spiritual abuse can play a role, but trauma is the response that one person's body or system is having to a specific experience. So, two people could endure spiritual abuse, and one could come out with trauma responses and one might not. Doesn't mean the abuse didn't happen to the other person. It just means the one person's body, brain interpret it differently as a different kind of level of threat in a sense, and is now responding to it in maybe a hyperactive way. I think it's important to note that two people can endure the same thing and respond differently, because the word trauma is just thrown around a whole lot these days. And the trauma is not actually the event, it's the
Right.
response that we develop.
Such an important point, because on the one hand, it's great that folks are talking more about trauma and they're hearing more about it and we have a greater awareness, and we really need to define these terms and what it looks like clinically so that we're all on the same page and we're talking about the same thing. Because absolutely, trauma is the response. And I was thinking as you were sharing how important this is for more sensitive folks to know, because highly sensitive people, when they're in adverse situations, they are more often deeply affected by it than people with less sensitivity. Though this doesn't mean that they're doomed to have a trauma response, but it does mean that there is a greater risk for that. So it's important to know when you are in a situation of spiritual abuse or experiencing religious trauma.
Yeah, for sure. So it might be helpful to touch a little bit on how it can present and maybe some red flags, just because I'm talking about this in such vague terms because it can be so different in different contexts. But let me just give some examples, and I'll just use some maybe church or family examples because those might be a little bit easier for people to relate to, or maybe a little bit more common. So, for example, a lot of what we hear with people who endure spiritual abuse is things like scripture. So, in a Christian context, we're talking about like the Bible, like Bible verses being used or twisted in a way to control somebody's behavior, maybe their appearance. And we hear that a lot with the way women versus men can, maybe what your hair can look like or can't look like, where you can go and who you can associate with. So a lot of times this comes, you're probably picking up on this with a lot of shame. Shame can be a big tool with spiritual abuse as a way to control people. A lot of shaming tones, condescending things used around scripture, especially even threats of losing your connection with God, losing your connection with your community if you don't comply with certain standards or just believe things the way that they think you should believe things. So that's a lot of kind of what I'm talking about when I talk about spiritual abuse. And I think, like I said, it's important to know this happens a lot with other forms of abuse side by side.
Mhm.
So, like with domestic violence, we hear of people who maybe were in a very conservative kind of circle and their spouse used scripture to control that they couldn't have a job and they had to stay home and raise children, and that you therefore don't have access to finances if your husband is also abusive. It's going to be even more difficult to get out because I feel like God doesn't want me to go have a job. That's like a sinful thing as a woman. So now I feel completely beholden to this man's will. So we can see how that's intertwined with things like domestic violence, and it becomes really insidious and complicated real quick.
Especially with this more spiritual layer, or like you said, different types of trauma or abuse can coincide and almost layer on top of each other. And part of this is dulling of your own sense of intuition or what's right for you. So being told by whoever is attempting to control you, for instance, that no, your perception of this is incorrect. You have to listen to me on how this is. This is what God is sharing. This is what this holy scripture is saying. So your perception of the situation is therefore incorrect, and which is such a struggle already for many highly sensitive people,
Yeah.
because with culture and family messages, even if it's a perfectly benign, there are often a lot of messages that are even nonverbal about sensitivity and no, you're overreacting or you're being too sensitive. Are you sure that's what's happened? I didn't notice that. And because people are perceiving things at a deeper level. So we often already have this sense of self-doubt about our perceptions of the world. So this would really just amp that up even more, is what I'm hearing.
Yeah, for sure. It's kind of like this weird, subtle gaslighting, right? You can't trust your gut or your experience, and let me tell you what actually happened.
Mhm.
And you see that a lot with spiritual abuse and religious trauma. Like these people or these leaders are speaking as if they're God. And if they lay that as a trump card, who can argue with that? Because if I believe in God and I believe God is powerful, I have this kind of reverence of that. So when you say definitively this is what God means by X, Y, and Z, I'm now backed into a corner and I can no longer trust myself.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's such a powerful cocktail, and such a powerful one that's difficult to get out of, to find your way back, especially if it's been maybe a majority of your life and you've never really known anything different, to find your way back to what feels true for me, what even are these physical sensations that I'm experiencing, and can I be aware of those and feel like those are okay to have as a sign of some of those red flags that you were sharing. We were talking too before we pressed record today. We were talking about how this can be so damaging for more sensitive people in terms of their psyche and their spiritual connection, and even how some of this subtle gaslighting, as you were saying, can really make people feel like their connection to God or the divine source, however they're conceptualizing that, how it can really damage that spiritual side of them. Because what we know about highly sensitive people is that they are often very connected to spirituality in whatever way that shows up for them. So there's a sense of wonder typically about being in nature, this very deep awareness of connection to the divine or to all living things. And this could really get in the way of that, is what we were chatting a little bit about.
Yeah. It's like it can stunt your growth in that sense, right? So if I'm trying to contain you into this box of what I think you have to be or how you have to act, or even what questions you're allowed to ask, think about how much that would affect somebody who's highly sensitive, who's generally a deep thinker, a critical thinker, a wonderer, and an explorer in that sense. So just this part of you, which I think is an awesome part of being highly sensitive, is
Exactly.
now being stunted or cut off or contained, and how that can impact just even your sense of self is so sad to me. And my practice is surrounded by, I do a lot of work with people coming out of even cult-like environments or just have religious trauma. And not everybody I work with is a highly sensitive person, but I would have to say everybody I've ever worked with has struggled with a sense of self coming out of these types of situations. It's so disorienting about being forced into this box and being told you can't trust yourself, you can't trust your emotions. And that's also a very common thing with spiritual abuse. And when we're talking about maybe in the Christian circles, it just you can't trust your emotion because your emotion is going to lead you astray. And so you have to shove your emotion to the side and not listen to it or honor it. So when we try and reintegrate that in the healing process, it can be a very difficult, scary thing. So I just wonder too, like as a highly sensitive person who's so in tune to the world around them, other people and cues, and even just their own emotional experience. Can you talk a little bit about that, like their own connection to their emotional experience?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's several threads of this. I want to talk to you about what you'd said about being really shoved into this box. But this is something I see, to start with your original question, this is something I see too a lot in my practice, where often highly sensitive folks, whether they identify that way or we're maybe discovering that a little later, where they're coming in and they're really up in their heads. They're not able to drop down into their bodies. And this can be part of the experience for highly sensitive folks without trauma anyway. You know, we tend to live more in the future and in the past than less sensitive people because we're deeply intuiting, we're deeply thinking about everything. That can often lead to anxiety. So that's a typical part of being highly sensitive, is maybe being more up in your head and having difficulty connecting to your body. But where the subtlety and the difference for me is with an experience of trauma with that is when it feels unsafe, like you were sharing. It feels very difficult and unsafe to be able to notice your bodily sensations or begin to trust that they are true and accurate. So when that's feeling threatening for folks, or when it's feeling like there is either maybe a panic attack or a sense of flooding or a sense of shutting down when they begin to tap into their emotions, that for me is a sign that we are really proceeding delicately at that point, working with a lot of trauma in the body that doesn't feel safe to be felt. And speaking of that gaslighting, there is often that sense of, can I trust my emotions? Can I even believe the information that my body or my emotions are giving me? So back to what you were saying about being shoved in a box. So there's this common personality inventory. It's called the Big Five. People know it as the Big Five. Some of them are extroversion, neuroticism, which just basically means anxiety, and some other things. And openness to experience are a few of those. So highly sensitive folks typically are more neurotic, so that greater anxiety, and they also score higher than most people on openness to experience. So that means you're more creative, you're more open to other perspectives, you're more open-minded in general. So when you have a sensitive person in a spiritual community who is naturally more open to other perspectives, they're more open-minded naturally, but you're being told, no, this is the limited box that we have to operate in. We can't believe those other things, or your experience is not accurate. That can be incredibly damaging.
Yeah, for sure. Just so invalidating of just who you are at the core, right?
Yes.
If that's something that you hold close as like a value of you, and how quickly that can start to crumble your sense of self and autonomy,
Yeah.
it's just that damage runs deep, right?
It does.
Yeah. And I think too, I've done this work long enough to know I've worked with people who've been in those realms for short periods of time and left. And I've worked with people who were raised in abusive, spiritually abusive environment and have religious trauma that was there from childhood. So when I think of a highly sensitive person being raised in an environment like that, it's like starting at ground zero with who am I? When they finally leave, which is so hard to do, which we can talk about shortly. But once they finally get out, it's like, wait, like you're floating in an abyss is how it feels as far as, wait, who am I? What grounds, what contains me out here? Because everything just would feel so disorienting because those normal developmental phases were kind of skipped because they weren't an option. So I've worked with people where it's like, let's get back to what do you like for a movie? It sounds silly as an adult having that conversation, but those are things kids talk about and they never got to do that perhaps. So let's go do that. Let's go see what you like in the makeup section. Maybe makeup was a forbidden thing. So it can just be like this process of really discovering who am I? Because that was maybe not an option for some people.
And I love that too, because then what we're doing is we're beginning to heal those developmental stages where we may have gotten stuck at those developmental stages. And we're making it a little playful with those examples. This doesn't all have to be so serious and intense all the time, because healing can be, and that's part of it. But to also bring in these maybe younger or more disassociated parts of us that really don't know, what kind of movies do I even, let's find out, let's just experiment, and no answer is wrong or right. You get to make this decision for yourself and have autonomy.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's talk too about the process of leaving a spiritually abusive environment and how that might affect a highly sensitive person. We know from people's stories, and we don't know this from research and statistics yet, but we do know from people's stories. And I speak with other therapists who do this work all the time. This is such a common theme. And in a sense, I feel like the best thing we can mirror it to is leaving a domestic violence relationship. You don't leave once and not go back, in a sense, with domestic violence. We know it takes 6-7 times for a woman to, I'm saying woman, but it can be a man too, to leave that relationship and not go back. So you might not actually leave the spiritually abusive environment multiple times, but I can think of it as attempting to start to leave and then you recoil back in. The reality of leaving an environment like that can be so traumatizing in and of itself. There can be a trauma around leaving because you know that you're potentially cutting off a lot of support for yourself. You could be losing a community of people that you've been a part of. You could be losing or starting to question even just the concept of your faith, which can be its own disorientation and its own kind of trauma. So how do you think of a highly sensitive person in that sort of quandary of my gut is still screaming at some level things are wrong, but people are telling me they're fine, but I really want to leave. And so what does that kind of tug of war maybe look like for a highly sensitive person?
Absolutely. Starting at a physical level, that often looks like GI tract issues. It often looks like maybe even you have a stomach ulcer in some situations. Again, this is different for everyone, but you're often going to have some really body-based physical anxiety where there are, not always, but there's a likelihood that you're noticing some kind of intestinal stuff, because what we're doing is we're holding all these emotions in. They're not safe to feel typically, so they're not going anywhere, and they have to be released in some way. So we're turning it inward instead of being able to express them naturally and helpfully. Another thing that we would see with highly sensitive people when they're starting to contemplate leaving an abusive situation, whether that's spiritual or otherwise, is because highly sensitive folks are so good, sometimes to a fault, it could be argued, but they're so good at being able to project what could happen. So being able to see, okay, I can see in front of me these different paths. And if I pick door A, then I can see the logical projection of what will happen there and the progression of that. And if I pick these other paths, then I can see clearly what would happen there. And this is a great strength to be able to project forward. Okay, this is the likelihood of how things will go. And it can also have that other side of we can become very overwhelmed or even overstimulated and get stopped in our tracks before we even get started. So, really, this sense of being stuck and not being able to move because you're so overwhelmed by either the sense of choice or by the possibilities that you can see could happen if you were to start to take action, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And I think too, just that looming threat of losing community and connection. And some people, it also feels like losing their connection with the higher power.
Exactly.
Or if we're talking about some other sort of spiritual realm of like maybe a level of healing they found as far as like a self-help group went, and then it got toxic. And so now I'm questioning, was any of this healing help real? And so you're facing these kind of really big looming questions that come with also the threat of losing community.
Absolutely. Can you speak a little to how, and I know every situation is different, but just how typical that is for people, either from the research or anecdotally, what you've seen in your work? How much is this sense of losing community typically a part of leaving a spiritually abusive situation?
Yeah, I have to say that I think almost everybody I've ever worked with has lost some social connection or grounding. Again, we don't really have statistics on that sort of thing, but
Sure.
anecdotally and just from people I've talked to who've done this work as well in different parts of the country and world, all say that is a very, very common theme of even even the perceived threat of losing the community is a big part of it. And most people, even if it wasn't truly a cult that we're talking about, but we're talking about just an environment where there's a like high control and a lot of spiritual abuse happening, they tend to just kind of drop you when you leave.
Sure.
Because there's a lot of like you're in or you're out kind of mentality and some of that us versus them stuff, which I think there's a spectrum when we slide into cult or not. But a lot of that is prevalent with spiritual abuse as at its core because that's part of the control. So a lot of times people feel like if you leave, we don't trust you the same way. So a lot of people have endured losing social connections, strained family relationships, if families half in, half out, those sort of things, or even having been cut off from a person who was like a mentor to you. Sometimes within churches, there's like a mentor that takes you under their wing. And then when you leave, that connection is now lost because we only do that to people in our church, right? And so now you're outside the door, not in it. And so we're just going to have a distance from you. And with some people, it's not as intense, but it's more of what we'll say hi to you in a casual sense, but we're still not connected socially the way we were before.
There's not that closeness or intimacy.
Yeah, that's just dissolved in a weird way.
Okay.
So I think there's a lot of anticipatory grief that happens
Yeah.
when I'm thinking of leaving because it's like, oh, I can see this is going to fall apart and I don't want to leave this person. But I'm at a point where it's a crossroad. And if I stay here, this is soul crushing. So I know I've got to get out, but I'm seeing the grief that's ahead. That's really scary. It's very looming.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wonder too, what are your thoughts of this, of how people might experience this? You said there's such a typical cutting off at some level. Maybe it's more extreme in other situations than certain, but where there's this removal of the social connection. How are people internalizing this, if at all, when you're working with them? Is there a sense of guilt? You mentioned that shame. How are people understanding this? Is it seen as their fault or are they seeing this as more a blend of things? I'm just curious.
I think it can depend a lot on like their individual experience, maybe even how long they contemplated leaving. Because some people really mull this over for a year or two. And so once they finally walk out the door, they feel a sense of strength now because they really felt prepared and they did it. But some other situations happen where people are sometimes almost forced out of an environment like that. And that can be its own kind of trauma, like almost an excommunication or we're starting to reject your pushback. And so now I'm forcibly removed. And so those people tend to really internalize it as like something's really flawed with me. They didn't want me as who I am in this group, or they didn't trust me for who I am. But I do hear a very common theme among spiritual abuse is a lot of, like I said, when there's a lot of teaching around shame or I'm inherently sinful and flawed at the core and can't be trusted, Now, once I've also lost my community, for some people, that reinforces those beliefs. Even if they want to not believe those beliefs anymore, there's this struggle. It's almost like I think of it as a tug of war of I don't believe that, but like my body believes that. I'm having these responses of as if it's true, but maybe logically I'm detaching from that belief, connecting it. But a lot of people do internalize it in some sense of I don't think I can trust me. Can I trust me? So that's why when I talked before about this kind of starting at the base and building up, who am I? And am I okay? Am I good? Am I inherently evil or what does that look like? So a lot of these things bring us back to very foundational questions of who am I? Because the core of a person is really attacked with spiritual abuse.
Right, because with some of the other types of abuse that we might see, there may be more externally focused. But I'm thinking, and reel me in here if this is too neat of an analogy. I've worked a lot with sexual abuse and trauma over my career, and that reminds me of how that's also
Yes.
people would say that's something that also attacks the core of you and is, I would personally say, again, I'd be so interested to hear your thoughts on this. But I would personally say that sexual abuse, which can be related to some, can go along with spiritual abuse, is also spiritually abusive in its own right because you are attacking the very core, like the deepest self of that person.
Absolutely. In a sense, you could argue almost any abuse is spiritual abuse because it's degrading the person at their core.
Right.
Abuse is a control manipulation thing, right?
Yep.
And so I'm not respecting you as your own autonomous person worthy of dignity. But yes, and sadly too, we hear way too many tales of sexual abuse within churches. The thing most people might jump to is the thoughts of clergy abuse within Catholic churches. That's been more in the news for a longer period of time, perhaps. There's a lot more of that coming out with evangelical churches, but that very often within a church coincides with active spiritual abuse. And so I am probably a spiritual leader over you who's also sexually abusing you. And so that's incredibly insidious too. The other thing that's kind of fascinating and tragic is a lot of stories I've heard of survivors who've gone through even sexual abuse within church will say the most traumatizing thing was the community not backing the survivor, backing them, but siding with the abuser or rejecting and shaming the victim. And so they found that secondary response is somewhat more traumatizing than the original abuse. So again, I think this speaks back to this concept of how important community is for people.
Yeah.
And you might think this was a bad apple. This one person did this bad thing, but my people have got my back. And then sometimes it turns out they don't. And so that's like a re-victimization, right? Now I am having this reinforced belief that, man, I'm not even worth all of these people standing up for me. So to bring it back to a highly sensitive person, I think this ties back into like their need for connection and community and how harmful that would be. Experience that.
Yeah, absolutely. We heal in community. And if that's cut off at the knees and you have been damaged within community, like you said, with that re victimization where no one has your back potentially, or there are some people that are listening and some aren't, that can be incredibly damaging on its own. But even especially for highly sensitive people, everything is felt more intensely, even if you're not someone who, say, for instance, cries at a drop of a hat. That's a common stereotype of highly sensitive people. And some people that are highly sensitive are more externally emotional. But
Right.
just because you're not externalizing emotion doesn't mean that you're not sensitive. So when we see this often is highly sensitive men, a lot of it has to do with culture. There's no gender difference across sensitivity. The research shows that it's 30% across the board, no matter how you identify. Women are not more highly sensitive than men, but because of culturalization, what we see is that highly sensitive men are often not showing those emotions. So they're locking it all in even more. So just that to say that, you may not be appearing emotional on the outside, but you're deeply experiencing these things inside, even if you're so disconnected from your physical body or your emotions for safety because you've had to, because you've been told that your experience is wrong or you're evil if you feel this way, whatever that messaging may have been. But those things are deeply felt and they do have ramifications if they can't be attended to. So this is often where, with a highly sensitive person, we might start to see those issues like chronic pain is a really common one, high anxiety, panic attacks. We'll have to see some kind of externalization because all of that stuff has to go somewhere. And your noticing more as a highly sensitive person. So fortunately and unfortunately, in the situations we're talking about, you're going to just notice more nuance and you're going to be more aware of people's facial expressions. So if you are in that situation where you're being re-victimized by your community not believing you, part of the trauma with that I've seen with folks is that they will maybe even be vividly recalling or re-experiencing what people's facial expressions were or their body language or their lack of response. That those really subtle things are going to be like a neon sign in the middle of Times Square to them.
Yeah. Yeah. This also makes me think, and maybe we can jump here too a little bit about like treatment and hope out of us from this. But when we're talking about being cut off from community and community being damaging, it makes me think too of how other professionals who do this work have talked about offering support groups and things like that, and find some people want them, but a large people don't. A group of people don't who have experienced spiritual abuse and religious trauma. Part of that, this is theory, of course, is that community was damaging.
Okay.
Even if this is a group of supposedly people who've gone through the same thing, I'm not sure I'm ready to talk about this in a group of even 5 people, because what if they don't respond in a supportive or validating way? I don't know if I can handle that again. So that's a little like side note as far as if you are somebody who's experienced this and are thinking of getting help, but groups like this offered and feel resistant, that's okay. It's not for everybody. And for some people, that might be a beneficial thing, but maybe for some more highly sensitive people, that feels super risky, especially right out the gate. Maybe farther down the healing line, that's a great way to reintegrate into a community and find some safety. But it really is about trusting your gut.
It is. And I'm so glad you mentioned that too, because yeah, some highly sensitive people in general, even without this layer of spiritual abuse, they're maybe going to be naturally reticent about joining a group. We do have highly sensitive extroverts, and they are 30% for the overall HSP groups, but 70% roughly of all highly sensitive folks are introverts. So it can feel really intimidating to go into a group of strangers and put yourself out there, even if it's a small, air quotes, small group of 3 to 5 people. That may stop you from going. So I love that you just normalized, like, that doesn't ever have to be part of healing for you, or it can be later, that this can look different for anyone. So if maybe small groups or maybe if that feels out, where could people start to begin on a path to healing? Do you have any suggestions for folks if they've experienced spiritual abuse?
Yeah. There are different books and resources and podcasts out there. Hello, here we are.
Here we are.
Yeah. And I think sometimes that the initial part of healing can be the validation piece. I am not alone. This is happening to other people. This is not happening just to a few people. It's happening to a lot of people.
Yeah.
And so we can find a little bit of strength and a boost to start talking about this or getting help when we find some other people's shared experience. That doesn't have to be in a group, but that can be through podcasts, books, things like that. And we can share some resources in our show notes too, which can be helpful for people. But I also think finding a therapist who understands, when we're talking about the intersection of a highly sensitive person, it'd be great if they are at least educated on the HSP presentation and what that experience is like, but also really well versed in trauma. There is a directory, it's actually an international directory now, of therapists who focus on religious trauma and spiritual abuse. And we can post that too in our show notes as maybe a helpful springboard for people. But we can talk too, but like, hopefully most therapists are offering consult calls to clients before scheduling, or if not, at an intake appointment. Really preparing yourself to ask some good questions about the therapist's education on trauma or understanding of maybe religious trauma or spiritual abuse. And again, like the highly sensitive experience, because we're talking about, that's a pretty specific little niche we're talking about. And I don't know many people know that specific focus, but there should be people with overlap of knowledge, even if that's not their specific focus. So can you talk a little bit about that? Even what are some questions to ask?
Yeah. And I think this can be such a revolutionary thought for many people too, because especially if you're highly sensitive, I'm generalizing broadly, but you tend to want to do the appropriate thing. Might seem a little counterintuitive for highly sensitive folks to go, wait, I can come into a consult call or a therapy session and be asking these questions of a professional, of a therapist. That can feel intimidating. Some questions that you can ask as a highly sensitive person are, what's your understanding of temperamental sensitivity, or have you heard of highly sensitive people? And if they haven't, that's not necessarily a deal breaker. There's a lot of great therapists out there who may or may not be highly sensitive themselves, who don't know
Right.
the trait of high sensitivity, but they have a certain maybe nuance in the way that they can provide therapy. They maybe seem to get you. And sometimes even that, if you're maybe willing to shop around a little bit, if someone doesn't feel like a good fit as a therapist, I think there can be this assumption that you have to stick with them. Almost like,
Right.
okay, I married them, I'm stuck with them, but they're a service provider. So if it isn't working for you, ideally being able to have that upfront communication of just saying, hey, I need more of this and this isn't happening, in my treatment. Let's talk about this. But whether you're able to do that or not, you always have the right to seek another therapist or ask for a referral to another therapist. If you just feel like they're not willing to hear what you have to say or they're not getting you, there is a directory as well for highly sensitive, knowledgeable therapists. And I'll link that in the show notes as well. Therapists also might be open to educating themselves, even minimally, on high sensitivity. And that's within your right to say, hey, would you be willing to maybe read a couple of these sources? Sensitivityresearch.com is a wonderful science based resource that also has the HSP tests on there that you can take. And so directing a therapist to that resource can also be something that you can do. And if they're not willing to do that, then that also gives you an idea of where they're at.
Gives you some information.
Exactly. So,
Yeah.
how about with spiritual abuse and religious trauma? What would you recommend for folks that are maybe either on a consult call, not sure what to ask, or looking for a therapist?
Yeah. I would recommend if that is something you're really wanting focus on to start at least with the directory that we can post. It's through the Reclamation Collective. And honestly, I don't know the percentage on this, but what I'm getting from the groups that I'm in as a therapist who focuses on it, a vast majority of people have experienced it themselves. It's definitely a specific focus that comes out of a lot of people having walked that road and found their own healing and wanting to help others. It seems to be very experience based kind of specialty. So if you find somebody on that directory, my point is you should have some confidence at least that they probably have experienced or really personal knowledge closely of what this is and what this looks like. So that might be a validating thing for you. But if you're doing a consult call with somebody who's not on that list, but maybe they say on their profile or their website they work with trauma, that's a good place to start.
Mhm.
But you might start asking questions just about, have you ever heard of the term spiritual abuse and religious trauma? Do you have knowledge of that? Some people might not have a clue what you're talking about, and that gives you some information. Some people might say, I've started to read about that, and it's an interesting thing that's emerging. But I think just asking that question and asserting yourself enough to say, this is really what I'm looking for help with, and I'm wondering if that's something you can help me with. There's different treatments people go through specifically for trauma healing. And there's not a specific modality for religious trauma resolution, but things like EMDR and there's different modalities. Those can be beneficial for healing from trauma. And we don't have research to back that one's more preferential to another, but it's really about personal preference and what's comfortable for you. Because some people feel like EMDR is too intense, or maybe that practitioner has training in that, but that's not what they do all the time. So maybe you can work with them and then a year down the road, explore the EMDR work. But I think asking those questions of, I need to come slowly into this, maybe. Are you willing to go at my pace? Are you willing to
Mhm.
follow my lead? Those are also really important questions because I'm guessing you would agree with me here that we believe in the autonomy of our clients. And if they are uncomfortable, we are absolutely not going there. Our job is not to force anybody into anything. That's
Absolutely.
the opposite of healing because this work is a lot about learning autonomy and finding your voice in the healing process. You're going to really want somebody who understands that and is going to live that out in the therapy.
And such an important point because highly sensitive people typically will need to go, and again, this is broadly generalizing, but they typically will need to go a little more moderately paced or even slower in therapy if you've had trauma, especially if there's complex trauma. And that's compared to single incident trauma, where you have one big thing that happens, is typically how people think of that. Complex trauma is much more of what we're typically seeing with the kind of trauma that we're talking about today, where it's multiple instances or it's over a long developmental span of time. So there are more things that are activating and deeply painful. So we need to approach those typically with more care. And when you're sensitive, that can be even more dysregulating to your nervous system. So we really need to proceed with caution. That said, it's really finding that sweet spot with a therapist who will push you a little bit, but with when you have autonomy, so where you are able to be in the driver's seat, you feel safe, you feel like they have the skills to help you come back down if you need to, and they're not pushing you outside of that window of tolerance. But also sometimes when we're doing trauma work, everything feels really terrifying, even if it's a very introductory step. So being able to inch our way forward and feel confident about that without getting stuck is important.
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. I think this is a great conversation. Hopefully it helps somebody.
I hope so too. I am really loving that we talked about the intersection of these types of trauma and how it can show up for highly sensitive folks. And we'll absolutely link those things in the show notes of resources for folks.
All right. Sounds great. Thanks, Steph.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Natalie. I got so into our conversation together that I completely forgot to ask Natalie on the air about where you can find her. So you can find her at www.nataliekember.info, and you can find her at Instagram at freedom.from.spiritualabuse. That's our show for today. I'm your host, Stephanie Gardner-Wright. If you found this helpful, don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review. I'll talk to you next time on the next episode of Sensitivity Sessions.